The votes are cast. All over Britain, the count begins as the nation decides.
This is BBC One.
It wasn't a very spectacular campaign, but it could be a very exciting result. The British people have today been making a momentous decision which will shape the pattern of British politics in the 1970s. Labour may form a third successive government, in which case the traditional conservative domination of British politics may be broken. From the 1880s until the 1960s, the British people put the Tories in office for 3/4 of the time. First the Liberals, then Labour seemed our inevitable minority party, only occasionally in power. If Mr. Wilson forms a third government, and if he lasts as Prime Minister through another Parliament, then he will have a longer unbroken period in office than Macmillan or Churchill or Lloyd George or Asquith or Gladstone or Disraeli, or indeed anyone since Lord Liverpool 150 years ago. But if victory against the odds goes to the Tories, it will deal a shattering blow to Labour and very possibly open a new era of Tory dominance. We'll know which way it's going within the next few hours.
Hello and welcome. So today I'm going to be talking about the 1970 election, and as you've just heard from the BBC coverage, there's lots of excitement in the air that Harold Wilson and the Labour Party might be on the brink of doing something truly historic, with Labour perhaps on the verge of winning a third successive general election victory. Now, Harold Wilson at this point is already one of Labour's most successful leaders, having won elections in both 1964 and 1966, with the 1966 victory being a landslide election victory, and so he'd been in power for around 6 years, putting him on a par with Clement Attlee, who'd been in power from 1945 to 1951, and who also won 2 elections in 45 and 50. So could Wilson go on to do one better than Attlee and win that third historic election? Well, all of the polling was suggesting that that's exactly what was about to happen, but those expectations would be confounded as the first results trickled in, suggesting in fact that there'd been a fairly large swing towards the Conservative Party and that Wilson had lost, and Heath would go on to win a 30-seat majority for the Conservative Party. Well, let's just pause then to have a look at that early part of election night where they're going through the polls and where the expectation is that Labour are going to go on and win another election.
Now, let's take a look at what the opinion polls had to say finally about the prospects as they saw them. Frankly, they were all over the place, and quite possibly one or two may be on the chopping block by tomorrow. ORC in the Evening Standard tonight was giving a 1% Conservative lead, pointing to a probable majority for the Conservatives over Labour of 20 points. At the other extreme, yesterday, Marplan in the Times was pointing to a 9% Labour lead, pointing to far better than 125, nearer 150 lead for Labour over the Conservatives. Now, the only sensible thing to do in this rather curious situation is to point to the average. Averaging all these up, you get 4.3% Labour lead as the considered judgment of 5 opinion polls. Now, Labour won last time with 7.3. They're pointing now to a 4.3. In other words, the Tories have chopped back the lead that Labour had in 1966 by 3 points. Converted into a swing, it looks this way. Here we had the position at the end of the last election, Labour with 111 majority over the Conservatives. Now, the opinion polls on average are saying a 1.5% Tory swing. They've cut back Labour a bit since 66, pointing again to a 70-seat lead for Labour over the Conservatives. But what Ted Heath needed to get was a 3.3% swing to knock out Labour's majority, or a 4.3% swing to give the Conservatives an overall majority. That's what he will be watching. Can he do it, in spite of what the opinion polls have said, in the battle that begins in a few moments' time? The opinion polls are on the chopping block. If they go wildly out, equally, every expectation will be foiled if the Tories can do what's required to get that position.
By the time of the 1970 election, Wilson had been in power for 6 years, and I would argue from the perspective of today that Wilson's government should be seen as a pretty radical reforming government, particularly when it came to implementing progressive changes to society that we'll look back on today as being very positive. The decriminalisation of homosexuality, for example, getting rid of the death penalty, making it easier to get a divorce, and the decriminalisation of abortions. So these were big domestic achievements. He also, in this period of time, set up the Open University. But I think when we're thinking about elections, these things probably are not that significant. More important was the Wilson government's management of the economy. And this hadn't gone quite so well. So the Wilson government's attempt to deal with industrial strife, to deal with unions going on strike, had not been very successful. In place of strife was the legislation that they wanted to put forward. That really had collapsed and been unsuccessful. And inflation was beginning to pick up. It doesn't sound like a lot today. Inflation was around 2.1%, but it allowed the Heath government to describe the 1970 election as the shopping basket election, and one of their party political broadcasts featured a £1 note being cut up to suggest that money was becoming less valuable because of inflation and industrial strife. Not that there was much by the perspective maybe of the 1970s, that was to come. Britain had also gone through in this period a devaluation crisis in 1967 and had failed in its attempt due to a French veto to enter the European Economic Community. And of course, England had collapsed out of the World Cup.
Germany are winning the match 3-2. And there is the final whistle. It's all over. Washington City referee calls an end to it. And England, the world champions, are out of the 1970 World Cup.
It was also a bad set of trade figures, right? So there were reasons why you would think that that actually expectations would be confounded and Wilson would go on to lose the election. It's not like Heath didn't have his problems too. The big problem Heath had to deal with in the 1970 election was the fact that Enoch Powell, a figure on the far right of British politics at this point of time, was making incendiary speeches about immigration, not least of which some years before was the notorious Rivers of Blood speech. And so Heath had this figure to his right, which he was attempting to distance himself from, and that could have potentially alienated voters that might have been natural Conservative voters, although some people actually think that the presence of Enoch Powell during this campaign might have even helped the Conservative Party to defeat Harold Wilson by allowing an appeal to be made to the right. So lots of factors to think about here. I would argue that probably the issue of competence and the economy was the primary reason why Wilson lost this election as he did.
Let's now bring you up to date with the actual state of the parties, give you a summary, really, of what's happened today. Robert Mackenzie.
Well, it has been the most sensational general election held anywhere since Harry Truman beat the opinion polls and Thomas E. Dewey in winning the American presidency in 1948. The State of the Parties Board gives us very nearly the picture of the new House of Commons. The Conservative lead over Labour directly at 41, and overall lead at the moment at 31. That's over all others. Now, let's look for a moment at the story of the election since 1945, just to place this one against its background. The great Attlee victory of 1945 was, of course, on the basis of a 148 majority in the House of Commons. That was cut down to a tiny majority of 6. A tiny majority of 6 in 1950, and the Conservatives then managed to get what was called a working majority and became one in 1951 with their 17-seat lead. Then they had a run of 2 further wins, what no party had done in over a century, that is 3 successive wins up to 1959. Then it took Labour 2 moves to get a working majority, the tiny majority of 4 in 1964 and the bigger working majority of 96 and 66. Now, what's striking about this is that whereas it took 2 elections each time to get a change of government, effective change of government, 50, 51, 64, 66, this time we've gone from a working majority for Labour to a working majority for the Conservatives in a single jump. It's the biggest gain against the sitting government which any government has achieved since the war. And that's the picture.
So to summarise, the 1970 election is an interesting election and an important election for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's the first election at which 18-year-olds had been allowed to vote. Secondly, it's an example of an election where the polls get it wrong. All of the polling, bar one poll, is expecting that Labour will go on to win another majority, and in fact Edward Heath wins a majority of 30. And thirdly, it's a rare example of an election where a government goes into the election with a significant majority, and that majority is overturned at the next election. And the last time that happened, and the only time it's happened really since 1970, is the last election, 2024, with Keir Starmer winning that landslide election victory, even though at the previous election in 2019, Boris Johnson had won a majority of 80. So these things happen very rarely. Well, that's all for me for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video, which is part of a series of videos on UK elections. I've done every election now from 1970 all the way through to 2024, and I'm planning to go even further back. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye for now.